In this video, I will tell you about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the beloved father of Singapore. He was in power for more than 40 years and played a significant role in Singapore's development. Without adhering to or imposing any specific ideology, he transformed Singapore into a major economic hub and one of the most prosperous and developed countries in the world. Before World War II, Singapore and Malaysia were British colonies. During the war, Japan, as Britain's adversary, invaded Singapore and quickly managed to conquer this defenseless country. At that time, Lee Kuan Yew was 18 years old and studying in college. After the war and Japan's defeat, the Japanese forces were compelled to leave Singapore. The British, who had abandoned Singapore during the war and provided no defense, returned to the country. Post-war, the lack of food and medicine caused suffering among the population, but conditions were still better than during the war. People returned to work, and students resumed their classes. Lee Kuan Yew also pursued higher education at the University of Cambridge in Britain to study law. He said, "While I was studying there, I would look at the British and think to myself, can they really govern my country better than I can?" When Lee returned from Britain, he voluntarily worked as a lawyer for a while, providing free legal services to people with low incomes. Later, he decided to form a political party with some of his friends to advocate for the rights of people who were dissatisfied and struggling with various problems. Thus, in 1950, Lee and his friends founded the People's Action Party, PAP. Over time, communists also joined their ranks. However, Lee did not have a good relationship with the communists and disagreed with their ideology. This eventually led to conflicts between Lee and the communists. Regardless, their party gained increasing popularity and Lee himself became more widely admired. He climbed the ranks in the political world and in 1959 became the Prime Minister of Singapore. Once Lee became Prime Minister, he faced two significant challenges in establishing a stable government in Singapore. First, Singapore was still a British colony. Second, the Communist Party had more influence than any other group. If the Communists gained power, Singapore's future would have been grim. For Lee, dealing with the British was easier than confronting the Communists. At the time, 70% of Singapore's population was Chinese, and extensive propaganda from China portrayed the communist regime as glorious and exemplary. As a result, communism gained traction among the Chinese population in Singapore, while the shadow of British colonialism still loomed large. Lee's genius lay in his decision to turn both threats into opportunities. To connect with all segments of society, Lee learned Chinese in a remarkably short time. He already knew Malay and English, and now with his powerful oratory skills, he could speak to people in multiple languages, rallying them to his cause. He later said, "If I hadn't mastered these languages, I might not have been able to move forward with my work. Learning Chinese showed the people how serious I was about connecting with them and how important direct communication was to me." Lee then strategically allied with Britain to eliminate the communists from Singapore. Being a realist, he also recognized that Singapore lacked the infrastructure needed for growth. Consequently, he decided to merge Singapore with Malaysia. In 1961, when the Malaysian Prime Minister proposed merging with Singapore, Lee welcomed the idea. He held a referendum in Singapore on whether to unite with Malaysia. The communists boycotted the elections and instructed their supporters to cast blank votes. Despite this, 70% of voters supported the merger, and in 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia. However, trouble arose almost immediately. In Singapore, Socialists launched uprisings to oppose the merger with Malaysia. Lee, who had anticipated this, managed to suppress the unrest, but things didn't improve much after that. On one side, extremist Malays wanted complete control over Singapore. As tensions and conflicts escalated, violence and bloodshed ensued. These disputes eventually led to Singapore's separation from Malaysia. Just 2 years after the merger, Singapore and Malaysia parted ways in 1965. Now independent, Singapore faced a host of challenges. Lee first worked to prevent the communists from regaining power. With the communist threat neutralized, Singapore was no longer under British colonial rule. Lee later remarked that the British were tired of governing Singapore and wanted to leave, provided they could entrust the country to a reliable government that wouldn't jeopardize their interests. After gaining independence, Singapore was in a dire state. The country had no significant natural resources to generate income. Poverty was widespread, unemployment rates were high, and more than half of the population was uneducated. So how did Lee manage to achieve such rapid growth in such a short time? The first thing Lee did was leverage his strong relationships with the West. He secured significant loans from Western countries and invested them wisely. He established industrial units and offered tax incentives to attract foreign investors. He also created a public savings fund for citizens, where 20% of their monthly salaries were saved. People could later withdraw this money or use it to secure loans when buying homes or addressing other needs. One of Singapore's biggest challenges at the time was housing. The housing situation was dire, with most people lacking proper homes. The city was surrounded by slums, which lacked even basic sanitation and services. These conditions also contributed to rising crime rates in impoverished areas. One of the first measures the government took was to pass the Land Acquisition Act. The government formed the Housing Development Board, HDB, to work on large-scale construction projects. At that time, only 10% of people lived in government provided housing. But the housing Lee built was so extensive, well-designed, and efficient that today, around 80% of Singapore's population owns homes of excellent quality. With the rise in home ownership, living standards improved and social problems diminished. Shortly after this, as production increased, unemployment in Singapore began to decline. It dropped from around 14% in the late 1950s to just 1.2% by 1982. In addition to these achievements, Lee managed to foster economic growth while controlling inflation, keeping the inflation rate at just 2 to 4% annually. Today, Singapore is the second easiest place in the world to do business after New Zealand. The economic incentives offered to investors are rarely seen elsewhere. In the early 1980s, with the economic boom that Lee brought about, Singapore's infrastructure was revamped, and its transportation system was upgraded to the highest standards. During this period, Lee also oversaw the construction of a major airport. Lee recalled, "Whenever I invited foreign investors, I would ask the protocol officer to ensure everything was in perfect order so that nothing would be out of place. I wanted them to know how serious and organized we were, and to trust that any work they delivered would be completed on time and to the highest standards." What kept Lee popular among the people over the years was his consistent honesty and integrity. When Lee began his career, Singapore had one of the most corrupt systems. But Lee quickly cleaned it up, forming a team that scrutinized the financial records of all officials, including his own. Once a financial scandal involving one of his ministers came to light. Before Lee could prosecute him, the minister committed suicide. In 1990, Lee decided not to run for election and instead served as an advisor. He explained, "I did this to see if the system I had created would remain effective without me. I wanted younger generations to come forward with some changes because society had evolved and the system needed to adapt." Lee served as an advisor to Singapore's leaders for several years. Finally, in 2015, at the age of 91, he passed away in the country he had built into a modern marvel. Without Lee, it's uncertain what would have happened to the people of Singapore. Would they have remained a British colony or fallen under communist rule? These questions remain unanswered. What is certain, however, is that Lee successfully transformed Singapore into a developed nation.